Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as you can see on the screen, we are going back to one of Simon's many channels. And this particular video is top 10 of the biggest what-if scenarios in history. I'll put a link in the description to the original content if you want to check that out and many of the other videos that they have for yourself. I see there's chapters here, so they've got them all broken down. I haven't looked at them ahead of time to even see what the what-if scenarios are. As many of you know, I do love a good historical what-if scenario because I think it's a powerful and unique way to look at what actually happened and analyze it from a different perspective by kind of playing it out in our minds. What would have happened if a different choice was made? What would have happened if this had gone differently? And that helps us to see just how significant that historical event actually was when we think out generations about how the whole trajectory of history may have been different because of that one event. You know, I think of some of the big ones like World War I not happening if Franz Ferdinand isn't assassinated. What happens if Napoleon doesn't invade Russia? What happens if the assassination attempts on Adolf Hitler are successful? One of those during World War II. Things like that. So I'm curious to see what they come up with and how they analyze these things. Join me as we do that.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenz, and in the video today, 10 of the biggest what-if scenarios in history. The world, well, it's full of what-ifs. What if JFK hadn't decided to go cruising through Dallas in an open-top car? What if Gandhi had never teed off with the British Empire? What if we'd been fully clothed that time the cops pulled us over? Well, that's the nature of things. I mean, we can never truly know, but we sure as heck can speculate. And thankfully, Earth's long, long history has given us plenty to speculate about.
And you know what? It's kind of funny to think about, but this isn't really history related, but even in our own lives, think about the small, at the moment, seemingly insignificant choices that we make and how they completely change our lives. At one point, many of you have heard me mention that I spent many years in youth ministry. At one point had 2 interviews during the same week, both at churches that were pretty close to home. And both of them offered me the job. And I actually only got the one interview because I interviewed at the first church, and somebody who was at that church heard about it and told somebody else, and then the second church interviewed me. I ended up choosing the second church that I interviewed at, and that was where I met my wife. So what if I'd never accepted that first interview? I never would have gotten the second interview. And what if I had chosen the first one and taken that job instead? My whole life's different because I never meet my wife. You know, my kids are different. My whole situation, my whole future changes. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about here.
The following are all turning points in our planet's story where things could have easily gone the other way. Some are pretty big and others are kind of small, but they all have one thing in common. Had things turned out differently, they would have led to a very different world to the one we live in today. So, if you're ready to start delving into the world of alternative history, well, you've come to the right place. Number 10. The Nazis finished their V3 Supergun. Nazi superweapon is such an overused phrase that it's practically a collocation, 2 or more words that are frequently used together as a single unit. You're welcome, by the way. Part of this fascination may be due to the fact that none of them actually worked. The V1 flying bombs were supposed to kill 100,000 Londoners a month, but instead killed less than 10,000 total. The V2 rockets were terrifying, but killed more people in their construction than they did landing on Britain and Belgium.
And what he means by that is there was a lot of slave labor that was used on the V2 rockets. Now, I will say this, that one of the factors that went into the decision to go down the road of Operation Market Garden to invade the Netherlands was that it was that part of Europe where the V2 rockets were being launched. And that had a significant impact, even if the V2 themselves the launching, didn't kill as many people as expected. The fact that it changed the deployment of troops during the war was significant.
V3 could have changed all of that. It was a top-secret Nazi supergun that was only discovered when the Allies overran its bunker on the French coast. The gun, it wasn't yet finished, but let's rewind history and imagine that it had been. Imagine the Allies, for whatever reason, didn't take northern France for a few months longer. What would the outcome be in this alternative reality? Pretty simple, really. There would be no such thing as London. The V3 could have rained one shell a minute onto the British capital, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It wasn't designed to turn...
Here's the thing, and this is why I disagree with this one. It's one gun. If that started happening, do you realize how quickly the Allied forces would have bombed that thing into oblivion? I mean, they had complete air supremacy at this point in the war. They would have sent just massive... I mean, there were these huge bombing runs that taken place. You know, they would have sent just hundreds of B-17s and Lancaster bombers, and they just would have turned that thing into dust. I don't buy this one at all.
The war in Hitler's favour, so much as ensure the Allies' only reachable capital went down with him. The Allies would likely still have won, but at the cost of the entirety of southern England and hundreds of thousands of UK civilian deaths. Post-war Britain would have been an economic ruin. Such poverty could have changed anything from how the Marshall Plan was allocated to whether Britain never gave up India to where...
And I'll say one more thing about this. You might say, well, why didn't they do that with the V2s? Well, V2 rockets were much smaller. They were mobile. It was a lot easier to protect where they were launching from. But a Supergun like he's talking about that could launch shells on London across the channel would have been huge. It would have been pretty immobile, and it would have been easy to find.
Whether the UK today has representation on the UN Permanent Security Council. Number 9. Franz Ferdinand isn't assassinated or survives. The most successful terrorist action of all time, Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in...
I would take exception with him calling that the most successful terrorist action of all time, because I don't think it achieved the aim that the assassin was hoping for. I mean, these were guys that were fighting for independence and fighting for Serbia. And if anything, this had the opposite effect on them. It led to a war that devastated that country. So I'm not buying that one. That part of that one. I agree that this is a huge what-if scenario, and I think it should be much higher than 9.
June of 1914 sparked off World War I, collapsed the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, created Yugoslavia, which in turn created the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, and everything from our understanding of ethnic cleansing to the modern states of Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, among others. But Princip's role in shaping the world was down to sheer fluke. The original attempt on Franz Ferdinand failed, and it's totally conceivable that the Archduke could have fled Sarajevo rather than waiting around awkwardly for Princip to assassinate him.
He makes such a good point there. This is one of those... The whole lead up to World War I, everything that happened in the summer of 1914, if you are a believer in the idea of fate or predestination or things like that, this is the ultimate example of that. There are so many things that, had they gone slightly in a different direction, the whole thing might have been avoided. Now, a lot of people argue World War I was inevitable because of the nature of Europe at that time, the way the armies and navies were building up, and there's a case to be made for that. But still, looking at these events, just the assassination itself, it required so many things to go wrong that day, and so many choices that could have gone differently. Franz Ferdinand should have fled after the first assassination when somebody threw a bomb in his car. But what does he do? He stays. He goes to the hospital, and then he stays after that. Taking a wrong turn, which his driver did down a dead-end street, and happening to go right by where Gavrilo Princip was sitting, contemplating taking his own life. Just all of these things, and then all of the stuff that went a certain way in the what they call the July crisis with diplomacy that could have gone differently. It's maddening, it's frustrating, and it's just amazing to think what could have been.
If things had gone down that way, the world right now would be utterly unrecognizable. In 2014, political scientist Richard Ned Lebeau published a book with this exact premise. His conclusions make jaw-dropping reading. Without Sarajevo, you have no World War I, which means no Germany ready to elect Hitler, which means no World War II. That means no Holocaust, which means no State of Israel or modern Middle East, and that's just one tiny part of this book. He also suggests the centuries-old Austro-Hungarian Empire would have not only continued, it would have become a beacon of tolerance due to its multinational population. Without World War I, the Russian Revolution may not have succeeded, which means no Stalin, no Eastern Bloc, and no gulags. It also means the European powers retain global dominance rather than letting America rise to the top. Number 8. Carlos II.
I honestly can't disagree with any of that, and I'm kind of curious about that book now. Now, that doesn't mean that something else worse might have happened, which led us down an even worse path. We just don't know, because if you'd have gone back to 1910 and told people, here's everything that's going to happen because of an assassination of the nephew of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, people would have thought you were nuts. So anything's possible.
Second manages to sire an heir. The Spanish War of Secession is likely the reason you're watching this video in English. At the time it kicked off, in 1701, Spain and France were the big superpowers in Western Europe, and Britain was relegated to merely rising star. The subsequent 13 years of bitter fighting, well, they changed all of that. It completely knocked Spain out of the running, damaged France's standing, and most important of all, it left Britain as Queen Bee. This had all sorts of crazy implications, from the fate of...
Now, a couple of things should be pointed out here. Number one is, in looking at this map, yes, for example, Scotland is still a separate power in 1700 that's only going to last a few more years at that point, but they're still united under one crown with England, Ireland, and Wales. And so really you can still think of them as kind of one entity politically and militarily. So that's one thing that is a little bit misleading there. I would back off a little bit from describing England as this kind of second-rate power. I think it's not quite like that. But I understand where he's going with this, that this is one of the things that leads England to dominance in Western Europe.
It left Britain as Queen Bee. This had all sorts of crazy implications, from the fate of the Spanish and British colonies in the New World to the reach of the Holy Roman Empire. The reason all of this happened was simply because Carlos II just couldn't make his junk work well enough for him to sire an heir. At the time, the only acceptable way to become king or queen was to be born to a ruler and inherit the title on their death. You couldn't just hold a free vote on your leader or anything dangerously insane like that.
Although there were some places where that was the way things were done, but by this point not too often. But boy, you could make this argument so many times in history where a childless ruler or a disputed succession happened and how differently the world could have gone. Just think of Henry VIII, if he had had a son earlier, if he and Catherine of Aragon had had a son that lived and was an adult by the time Henry died. Boy, things could have gone so differently there.
This was a massive problem, as Carlos II was impotent. Years of inbreeding in his family had left him a genetic basket case. But what if he'd managed to sire, say, a single son who was normal enough to survive into adulthood and...
And look, there's that Habsburg chin right there. If you see the Spanish Habsburgs, they all have that chin like that.
Rule as a king. Well, for starters, you'll be looking at a completely redrawn map of Europe, plus a much more Spanish-influenced New World. Britain likely wouldn't have conquered half the world, with the result that English would today be a much less dominant language. Number 7. Bill Clinton's defense secretary tells the truth about bombing North Korea. World-changing what-ifs don't have to all take place in the distant past. Some can be much, much closer to home.
I agree with that, but of all the things in recent history you could have chosen, I don't know if this is the one I'd put in the top 10.
Such was the case in 1994 when Bill Clinton summoned Secretary of Defense William Perry to brief him on the situation in North Korea. At the time, there were worries about the North's nuclear program. Some things apparently do never change, and the possibility of an attack on South Korea. Clinton wanted to know if the US could successfully take out the North's reactor at Yongbyon without causing contamination. Perry believed that it could. He also believed telling the president that would lead to Clinton authorizing a strike, which in turn would lead to total war on the Korean peninsula. So he kept quiet, the nuclear reactor wasn't bombed, and modern East Asia was created.
I'll say this. Just because he asked that question doesn't mean that was what he was going to do. sometimes you ask questions because you want to know what your options are. You want to know what recourse you have. It may have even been that knowing he was able to do that could have been used as leverage in terms of diplomacy. So I'm not entirely sure that this one is as serious as he makes it out to be.
The war on the Korean Peninsula was later gamed by the Pentagon to end in a minimum of 1 million casualties. 300,000 shells from North Korea would have leveled South Korea's capital Seoul in a single hour. Nearly as many US servicemen would have died as during the Vietnam War. Given the way the Vietnam War shook up US culture and politics, it's hard to imagine Korea too doing otherwise.
So yeah, I feel like that's a really dark, extreme scenario on that one. Doesn't mean it couldn't have happened, but I don't think it's likely.
But the biggest effect would have been on Asia. South Korea today is a regional economic powerhouse, not a bombed-out wasteland. China would have had to deal with a US force right on its border, possibly leading to conflict. On the other hand, though, there'd be no Kim Jong-un developing a scary nuclear program. Number 6. The Romans win the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. They say that a butterfly beating its wings in Ohio can cause a tornado in China. Well, wait.
I don't see many butterflies beating their wings here in Ohio, but yeah, the butterfly effect is what this is about.
Wait until you hear about what a battle you've never heard about in 9 AD could have done to the modern world. Had the Romans won the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the world as you know it simply wouldn't exist. For one thing, the English language would have never evolved. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was a hugely significant moment for the Romans. After Germanic tribes unexpectedly whooped 3 of Rome's mightiest legions, wiping out 10% of the entire Roman army, the empire gave up on conquering northern Europe. The empire's boundaries were set, creating a divide in Europe you can still see today. All that stuff about how southern Europeans, Spanish, Italians, French, have one attitude to life, money and religion, while northern Europeans, Germans, Swedes, Danes have another, well, that's all Teutoburg talking. I can't quite stress...
That's all Teutoburg talking. Yeah, that's fair. I think he makes a really interesting argument there. And it is fascinating. The further you go back, obviously, the more things diverge. If you're going back to a diverging point 20 years ago, the world looks less different than if you go back to a diverging point 2,000 years ago because of all the dominoes that would fall after that. But yeah, I mean, English is a Germanic language. Obviously, the North Germans are part of that Anglo-Saxon influence into Britain. A lot of things change.
It's how important this was. If Rome beat those tribes and went on to conquer much of modern Germany, Germanic languages would cease to exist. It also means that the social divides wouldn't be there for Martin Luther to get all worked up about in 1517 and turbocharge the schism between Catholicism and Protestantism. So there's no 30 Years' War. The whole Western world would remain Roman Catholic, affecting culture, art and science in unimaginable ways, all because some guys got jumped in a forest over 2,000 years ago.
I don't know how I feel about the part about Martin Luther because, I mean, the fact is that that all of Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire, so it was very Catholic anyway. I just don't see how that would have influenced like a whole Martin Luther type of thing. I mean, unless you're arguing that North Germany wouldn't have become Christian at all. But I think the opposite's probably true. I think it's more dominated by Christianity. I don't know. That part confuses me a bit.
Number 5. Japan doesn't bomb Pearl Harbor. Alright, let's get the big obvious bit out of the way. Yes, an America that doesn't suffer the trauma of Pearl Harbor still enters World War II. The Japanese were desperately in need of resources when they bombed Hawaii. That was their whole rationale for going toe-to-toe with a much bigger country. The problem was that most of those resources could only be found in US-administered places. Had Pearl Harbor not happened, the US would have still gone to war in the Pacific after expansionist Japan eventually invaded the Philippines or Guam or wherever. The key word here is eventually. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the US public didn't want war. Without the Japanese attack, the tide of opinion wouldn't have changed. That means no American support for Britain and the USSR against Hitler, and, well, that means trouble. So sure, by December of 1941, the Brits, they were reasonably sure that Germany wasn't going to invade, and also Hitler had already made his major mistake of invading Russia. In short, the Third Reich, it was already pretty doomed, but it could have gone down in a completely different way.
Yeah, it was already pretty doomed, and keep in mind that even though Pearl Harbor is the official entry of the U.S. into World War II, the U.S. is already not neutral, already heavily involved in giving supplies and materials and even weapons and things like that to the British and to the Russians, things like that, the Soviets. So, Yeah, I agree. U.S. probably still enters the war, by 42, but different scenario for sure.
In this scenario, the Brits are no more than support for the Russian bear as it slowly, inexorably dismantles the Nazi state in a brutal battle of attrition that kills even more than died in the real world. And do you want to have a guess what Stalin would do after liberating Europe? Well, he'd likely take almost all of it for himself, creating a scenario where possibly everywhere but Britain eventually falls behind the Iron Curtain. The US, meanwhile, is isolated and no longer seen as the 20th century's moral leader. Number 4, Napoleon.
Can't argue with any of that. I don't know if Britain falls behind the Iron Curtain, but you definitely see much more Soviet dominance in Western Europe, which is a scenario that the Allies would have wanted to avoid. Ooh, this is a big one.
Doesn't invade Russia. Sticking with megalomaniacs and foolish plans to invade Russia, let's look at the 19th century's most foolish megalomaniac of all. Napoleon was the most feared military commander of his time. By 1812, it single-handedly demolished the millennia-old Holy Roman Empire, brought the Austrian Habsburgs to their knees, completely isolated Britain from all continental trade, and even forced the Russians to do exactly what he wanted them to do. He seemed pretty damn unstoppable. And then in 1812, he made one of the dumbest mistakes a military commander has ever made.
Absolutely. Can't argue with it. I mean, when you look at the losses that Napoleon suffered and how it still took a couple more years for combined European powers to take him down, the whole world looks different. And Napoleon, unlike a lot of military dictator types over time, was a fairly good administrator, I think. And I think he doesn't invade Russia. Maybe you see the other European powers like England and Russia and others maybe kind of coming to terms with Napoleon's influence in Europe.
After Alexander I broke the trade embargo against Britain, the French general decided to teach him a lesson. He invaded Russia, setting into motion a chain of events that would see his army decimated and humiliated, hundreds of thousands of French soldiers killed, a new European alliance rise up against France, and Napoleon's ultimate defeat and exile. Yeah, despite what you hear, it wasn't the British at Waterloo that took down Napoleon, it was the insane losses the dictator suffered while attacking Russia.
The British at Waterloo, it was just, I mean, in Waterloo, of course, wasn't his first defeat. He was forced to abdicate a year before that. But yeah, it was just the writing on the wall was there after Russia.
Tactic Hitler would revisit over a century later with similar results. So, with no invasion of Russia, you have an invincible Napoleon who unites the whole of Europe and molds it in his image. And you want to know what the craziest part of all of this is? It could have actually happened. The decision to invade Russia made no strategic sense and was only taken to punish Alexander I. Had Napoleon let it slide, or simply say chosen to sack a single city in retaliation, the world today, it would be completely different.
Yeah.
Number 3, Rommel.
And honestly, I don't know that would have necessarily been a bad thing. There were a lot of reforms and things like that Napoleon did that were actually pretty decent stuff. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that one. Do you think that the world's a better place if Napoleon doesn't invade Russia? Do we not end up with the chain of events that lead us into World War I, World War II, the Cold War, all those things?
Rommel isn't absent during D-Day. Erwin Rommel was many things: a good strategist, a highly decorated commander, and one of the most influential people in the Third Reich who wasn't a complete scumbag. He should probably also be remembered for taking the worst-timed holiday in history. In 1944, Rommel took time off from his position in occupied France to celebrate his wife's birthday. And do you know what the most popular name for that auspicious date is today? Well, that's D-Day. That's right, on June 5th, 1944, Rommel dashed off to Germany for a quick liaison with his darling wife. 24 hours later, the Allies stormed the beaches, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi domination of Europe. While we can't know for certain how things would have gone if Rommel was there, we do know that the remaining commanders were panicked and confused and completely screwed up the German response. A commander of one of the panzer divisions later bitterly wrote, "If Rommel had been with us instead of in Germany, he would have disregarded all orders and taken action. Of that, we are convinced."
I don't know if Rommel would have disregarded all orders. First of all, remember, Rommel was not the general-in-chief in the West. I think that was von Rundstedt. He was obviously in command locally. And number two, there were standing orders, and I think that's what they're referring to here, about the use of some of the panzer divisions and things like that were being held in reserve. And I don't know that Rommel would have violated those orders. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But I feel like this one doesn't change a whole lot.
So, in the spirit of this video, let's imagine that Rommel had been there. Now let's imagine he mounts a successful defense and the Allies find themselves experiencing another Dunkirk. So, what happens next? Well, either Nazi dominance of Europe is ensured for even longer, maybe even giving the Germans time to complete their V3 gun and bomb London flat, or maybe, just maybe, Rommel becomes enough of a German hero to mount a successful coup against Hitler, something he had vaguely discussed before with others. So sort of a mixed bag there, some good, some bad. Number 2, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI escape the French Revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 to 1799 put a powder keg beneath old Europe and exploded it with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs. Old certainties, they shattered. Conditions fell into place that would see ancient empires just swept away. The way we look at the world was fundamentally changed. While it would take some big changes to put the revolution back in its box, it could still have had a completely different outcome. One in which Louis XVI doesn't go to the guillotine but instead escapes France to inspire the monarchist forces from abroad. In June 1791...
I will say this, though. I mean, that happened anyway. Even with Louis XVI and then later Marie Antoinette being executed, you still have France going to war with other European powers in the aftermath of the revolution. Of course, that leads to Napoleon, his rise. So initially when I saw that, I thought, yeah, boy, that would change things. But as I think about it a little more, I think a lot of the stuff that he's arguing would have changed kind of happened anyway.
Louis XVI was on the cusp of fleeing. It had already been arranged for the king to be spirited away from Paris in a light carriage, smuggled across the Belgian border, and delivered into the hands of a royalist alliance. The only reason this didn't happen? Well, Marie Antoinette insisted on going with him at the last minute, which meant using the slower carriage, which meant they missed an important rendezvous with loyal guards, which led to them being recognized and caught a mere 25 miles from the border. The rest, well, as they say, is history. Say they had escaped. It's not so hard to imagine an exiled king giving the royalist forces a rallying point. At the very least, it's easy to see Louis sowing discord from exile, putting the ultimate outcome of this turbulent time in doubt. Number 1. 9/11 is foiled. 9/11 is the most significant event to happen to the USA since Pearl Harbor. The collapse of the Twin Towers and the murder of nearly 9,000 people in NYC, Washington, and Pennsylvania affected everyone who was alive.
Did he say 9,000 people were murdered? Let me back up and make sure I heard that right.
Murder of nearly 9,000 people in NYC, Washington, and Pennsylvania.
It was close to 3,000. It wasn't 9,000. Okay, somebody screwed up on the script on that one.
Affected everyone who was alive to witness it on a deep and fundamental level. The intelligence failings that led to the attack's success are manifold, and perhaps halting it simply wasn't possible. But some, like former Clinton and Bush White House staffer Richard Clarke, thinks that there was a chance in 2001 of 9/11 being averted. Had that chance been...
Richard Clarke's not exactly what I would call a unbiased source for this kind of stuff, but
taken 2017, well, it would look very, very different. For one thing, Islamist terrorism would have been nearly the issue it is today. 9/11 not only demonstrated the terrible capabilities of jihadists, but it also inspired countless others to set off bombs in Madrid, in London, and in Paris.
I don't know, that stuff was going on before 9/11. I mean, that was the second time that the World Trade Center was bombed in a number of years. I don't know if that would have changed a whole lot.
Nor would the biggest Islamist terror group be around at all today, and that's ISIS. ISIS rose out of the invasion of Iraq, an invasion that was in part sparked by the traumas of 9/11. Without it, Saddam isn't toppled, the Iraqi government doesn't collapse, and the revolutionaries don't ultimately morph into the most reviled terror group in history. Mass surveillance, its powers boosted in the post-9/11 era, also doesn't become such a huge thing, meaning no Edward Snowden revelations and no NSA nosing through your every email. And that's before we even get into the effect on culture. A world without 9/11 is a world where the USA still feels sure of itself, where it still feels invincible. This would be reflected in all of the TV, movies, and games surrounding us. In short, the world, it would be a really different place. So I really hope you found that video interesting.
So yeah, again, I don't think I'd put that number 1. I think, for example, Napoleon not invading Russia should be much higher on the list. But interesting list. Let me know your thoughts. What would you add to this list that wasn't there? What is one of the what ifs that wasn't mentioned that probably would have changed our world forever? Use the comment section below, and if you want to check out more from this channel, the link's in the description. Thanks for watching.